Okay, so in this video we will be discussing Pakistan Studies Key Question 3 for GCSE level. Key Question 3: what were the causes and consequences of the War of Independence 1857 to 58? So, there were many different causes. Number one, political. If you start off with that, you have, lots of reasons. Starting with the introduction of Doctrine of Lapse by Lord Dalhousie in 1852. If a ruler was to die without a male son, his state would go directly to British control. Many lands were given away to the British like this, and this caused a lot of resentment to the British by the Indians. Second point would be about the mistreatment of the Mughal Emperor. So the British actually moved the royal family, or the Mughal Emperor's family, to Red Fort in Delhi, which actually made the Indians upset as well because it disrespected. The Indians felt disrespected. Number three, you have Persian English replacing Persian as the official language and the administrative language. This meant that all the people who were working in the government, they had to learn English, and they had to get rid of Persian from their hearts. Not really, but they just had to forget about it in terms of administration. Number two. Number two, you have social and religious. Point number one in social and religious is the spread of the British control. British control spread rapidly. So, point number two, religious and social. British political control grew. It grew at a really rapid pace. Many new British goods were being introduced into India, and trade was going on as usual. The British considered themselves to be a superior race, and that they had a superior culture. Even in 1835, an English administrator talked about how a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. That's point one. Point two would be about how the British were treating Indians as an inferior race. In general life, the British treated the Indians as an inferior race. They didn't really mix together. The British regarded themselves as small oases in a largely uncivilized world. They were just bossing the Indians around, basically, and their new introduction of railways, roads, and development in general also was not liked by the Indians. Point number three or you could say religious point, is that the British introduced Christian missionaries, which basically it was basically teaching Christianity, and the Indians did not like that because they felt that their religions were being threatened, like Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism. They didn't like it, and yeah, that's basically it. It just taught Christianity, and the British thought that these religions would simply just the people from these religions would simply just renounce their faith and follow Christianity, but they didn't do that. Number three, economic. Point number one would be heavy taxation. The British heavily taxed the people. They had really high taxation on every product, on everything, just so they could exploit India's wealth to the highest degree. Peasants and small landowners found it very difficult to pay these taxes, and in the War of Independence, they just took the side of the rebels just because they wanted to get rid of these huge taxes that they were being overburdened with. Point number 2 would be about the low salary of the Indian sepoys. It's basically just a point. Um, Basically, how the Indian soldiers were being paid less compared to the British soldiers. They didn't like that. Another point to the War of Independence. Point number 3 would be about the economic policies of the EIC. The economic policies were basically that it was more favorable towards British goods. Um, so the British, they kind of made the products that they sold really low. Like British made goods were extremely cheap compared to Indian made goods, and this was just bad for the Indians in general because they weren't making enough money. More money was being given to the British, and that's just another factor that led to the War of Independence. Final factor is military. There were there was actually a lot of discrimination in the ranks of the military. You know how the Indians were being treated as a lower race, they were being paid less, and they were also only given the roles of sepoys, or sepoys, and cavalry, and the British were given the roles of officers. This was just really normal during that time. Um, Another point would be that the Indians were being forced to fight abroad. They didn't like that, like how they fought in Afghanistan. They didn't really want to leave their country. And another point would be Indians were being forced to convert to Christianity, and again, they didn't like that. And the most important point, the the immediate cause of the War of Independence, is the grease cartridges. British introduced a new type of rifle um, where there was a paper cartridge covered in grease to keep the powder of the rifle, like the gun, dry. It was rumored that the cartridge was covered in grease made from the fat of both cows and pigs, and the Indian sepoys from Muslims and Hindus were all were all angry at this, and they refused to fight, and they refused to use these new cartridges. So this was the most immediate uh, cause of the War of Independence. That's it.